The institution of the church has been around for over 1,000 years. Today, the church is often conceived of not in terms of its physical space, but in terms of its community. It is not uncommon to hear someone say, "The church is not the building, it's the people." And yet, for thousands of years, Christians have been gathering and filling physical spaces. They have inhabited houses, catacombs, temples, chapels, theaters, schools, and cathedrals. Some are filled to the brim with art and ornamentation. Others' walls are bare and nondescript. Yet the walls themselves speak. Whether we recognize it or not, church buildings have been speaking to us for centuries. In fact, one of the best ways to understand the history of the church is to take a look at its architecture. This exhibit will showcase two churches, a 3rd century house church at Duraeuropas in Syria, and one of the most long-standing cathedrals, Notre Dame of Paris. As you explore these buildings and compare their architecture, think about the ways their buildings communicate theology and faith through the ages, and how our own buildings might do the same today. These old churches serve as windows into the past and reflections of Christian practice. As you explore these two fascinating churches, try to also explore the churches of our own day. After a year in a pandemic, without the ability to meet in our buildings consistently, what do you think the church is going to look like going forward? How will the buildings shape the community? And how will such buildings speak to us and the culture around us? The Church of Duraeuropas. The Church of Duraeuropas is a fascinating look into the early church. In the early stages of the Christian movement, Christians would meet in houses to share meals, hear teaching, and be in community. As groups became bigger and more well-established, actual church buildings began to appear, though they were often converted spaces rather than entirely new. This was the case for the church at Duraeuropas, which was converted from a private household to a designated church building in the year 240 AD. From the outside, this building would have looked like any other Roman house, but on the inside it had been transformed into a religious space. Such a project would have required at least some amount of wealth and stability, so it is likely that the building was donated and wealthier members of the church would have aided in transforming it. Another factor contributing to the culture and the practice of this early church was the absence of an official biblical canon. A fragment of Tatian's Diatessaron was found at the site of the church, indicating that the congregation had access to the harmony of the Gospels. It is also possible that the Christians shared manuscripts with the synagogue if they were on good terms, or that they would have received traveling manuscripts that circulated at the time. For the most part, however, the texts that this Christian community had access to can only be speculated. Along with this, one wonders what the life situation of Christians at this time was really like. The 3rd century was a tumultuous time for the entire empire, let alone for a minority group in a border town. Yet the fact that Christians were able to convert a house to a worship space is remarkable, especially considering the limited privacy of Roman homes and the political instability of the time. Perhaps the chaos of the times distracted from the small Christian group in the town, or perhaps this border town was far too cosmopolitan to begin policing the many different religions housed there. Whatever the case, this building stood for 16 years until it became a barricade in 256 during a war against the Persians. Though destroyed for a time, the fact that this building was filled in by rubble actually helped preserve it so that we are able to see it today. Let's explore this 3rd century church. Begin at the entrance of the floor plan on the north side of the building by the vestibule, and feel free to walk through the floor plan as you listen. As you walk towards the courtyard, note that Roman houses were not like the private homes we have today. Since many people conducted businesses out of their homes, Roman houses were actually semi-public. The entrance hall led to an open courtyard and a portico where people could meet and inquire about business, with no invitation necessary. The church building maintained this feature of the domestic space, which causes one to wonder just how secretive the Christian community really was. On the southernmost end of the building was the assembly room, which was used for teaching and worship. Congregants would meet here for the regular Christian gathering and for the sharing of an agape meal or the Eucharist. For those not initiated into the church, or the non-baptized, a teaching room existed at the west end of the building connected to the assembly room. Non-baptized believers would meet here during the Eucharist, as only those who were baptized could partake in it. In this room, it is assumed that converts were taught about the faith. Once both sure and educated of that faith, the initiates would move into the baptistry. Here, initiates took in the artwork depicting biblical stories on the walls, perhaps placing themselves within their narratives. At the west end of the room was the baptismal font, a small, shallow basin with a water jar next to it for baptism. Believers would be anointed and then baptized, becoming full members of the church. The baptistry itself is the only room in the building with paintings on the walls. Perhaps a special focus was given to the baptistry, or perhaps this was the only place they could afford to paint pictures, but nonetheless, it remains a window into the faith of early Christians. Once out of the baptistry and passing back to the front door, there is a staircase leading to an upper level. This level did not span the entirety of the building, but took up half the floor plan, and it is possible that this space was used as storage for donations and almsgiving, since this was a common practice of the early church. Such a building is fascinating to observe, and starkly contrasts the churches that would follow it, and certainly the churches we attend today. The Baptistry. The Baptistry is a striking combination of art and theology. All along the walls of this room are many different biblical scenes: David and Goliath, a procession of women, the healing of the paralytic, the Good Shepherd, Jesus and Peter walking on water, the woman at the well, and Adam and Eve in the garden. Such a combination of biblical stories is fascinating no matter what, but it should be noted that these paintings appear much more amateur compared to the paintings found elsewhere in the town. Nonetheless, these scenes work together to create a narrative that the onlooker could immerse themselves in, while also informing them of the meaning of baptism. These specific scenes evoke themes such as anointing, being welcomed into the family of God, and the defeat of evil. Such a striking claim made by these pictures would have come up against many of the pagan religions as well. The Mithraeum, less than 1 kilometer away from the church, was a male-only cult that worshipped Mithras as the bringer of light and as a savior, and hoped for the promise of eternal life. The baptistry, however, was a place where both men and women were welcomed into the fold of God through Jesus, the one who promised life after death. While Christians and other religions in this town worshipped different gods, it is striking to note the repetition of themes of victory over death and eternal life. Perhaps these themes were all the more emphasized and necessary in a context where death seemed imminent and chaos was always rearing its ugly head. The Town of Duraeuropas. The town of Duraeuropas was founded by the Hellenistic Seleucid Empire in 300 BC. Its placement was extremely strategic, situated along the Euphrates and right along the east-west trade route. Originally called Duraeuropas, it was nicknamed Dura by its inhabitants, which means fortress, because of its military role and fortified walls. The Roman armor and shield depict what the soldiers living in this town could have looked like in the 3rd century. Along with this, its location on the river and the trade route made Duraeuropas a blend of Eastern and Western cultures. It was extremely cosmopolitan and multicultural. This is reflected in the many religious buildings found at the site. The Mithraeum and the synagogue, along with the church, are the most well-preserved buildings, all in the same 1-kilometer strip. At the time that the church in Dura was established, the Roman Empire was in control, though it was a messy and chaotic time. The town itself became ruins in 256 AD, falling to the Sassanid Empire. The church building itself only stood for 16 years. The crisis of the 3rd century. The Church of Duraeuropas existed during a time of grave upheaval and uncertainty in the Roman Empire. The years 235 to 285 AD were named the crisis of the 3rd century for this very reason. In some ways, this crisis was a problem caused by the Roman Empire itself. In order to keep troops loyal and to guarantee a large army, the empire began promising land and money to those who joined the army. Unfortunately, Rome was forced to go on the defensive and failed to conquer any new lands, thus failing to pay out its soldiers. Bitterness against the empire reached its climax when Severus Alexander chose diplomacy to settle a fight rather than attempting to plunder, which led to his assassination and the installment of the first Barracks emperor Maximinus I, or Thrax, in 235 AD. Here began the process of chaotic rule, as Thrax had no claim to succession apart from the support from the military. There were no more rules determining who could ascend to the imperial throne. This plunged the empire into chaos, with Rome seeing 26 emperors claim the title in just 50 years. Political instability was further aggravated by the Antonine Plague and the Plague of Cyprian, which killed many agricultural workers and soldiers. Rome also faced the threat of foreigners, particularly the Sassanid Empire, which threatened them from the east. Inflation of Roman currency also became so great that the coin was essentially worthless by the end of the 3rd century, and the empire resorted to trade without currency. Needless to say, this century was full of chaos and strife on many levels. Anyone living at this time could not escape instability or uncertainty, yet this may have caused somewhat of a respite for Christians. Distracted by the ever-pressing problems of inflation, invasion, and plague, the state was, with some exceptions, less occupied with Christians. That is until Diocletian took the throne, bringing peace to Rome and the great persecution to Christians. The Cathedral of Notre Dame. The Cathedral of Notre Dame itself has held a myriad of meanings over the centuries and cannot be limited to a single purpose. Upon its construction, Notre Dame was first and foremost a church and certainly an architectural masterpiece. Beginning in 1163, this cathedral took 100 years to finish, with many other features or reconstructions being added on in later centuries. This structure has housed worship for over 800 years and has a particular way of speaking to the masses. In the Middle Ages, common people could not understand the Latin services, nor could they participate in the Eucharist except during Easter. Space and distance was emphasized by both the floor plan of the church and the rituals practiced in it. Within the Christian tradition, there is a paradoxical understanding that God is both immanent, which is near, accessible, and relatable, and transcendent, distant, holy, and other. In our contemporary society, we tend to emphasize God's immanence. Within the medieval context of Notre Dame, God's transcendence was emphasized. The cathedral buildings served to inspire and invite people into the awe and wonder of the mystery of God. Stepping into the cathedral was like stepping into the heavenly city itself, and the eyes would be drawn upward almost immediately to a display of light and color. In a space like this, it is hard not to be reminded of God, and in fact the pictures and images displayed throughout the cathedral functioned like a biblical picture book for the illiterate to read. There was certainly a tension then between the inaccessibility and accessibility of God to the illiterate masses. One can only imagine how this would have impacted their faith. Let's look at the floor plan of the cathedral, and feel free to walk through as you listen, and visualize the space being described. Even the outside of Notre Dame is arresting and intricate. Beginning on the west side, there are 3 entrances or portals. Each portal consists of sculptures above the door that evoke a biblical scene or saint. Most enter through the portal of the Last Judgment, depicting saints as the cloud of witnesses. Upon entering the cathedral, one is struck with the sheer magnitude of the building. The building itself is 130 meters long, with the nave taking up most of that length. The entire church of Duraeuropas could fit into one of the towers on the west end of the building. In the nave, there are many pillars raising the ceiling high above the observer, as well as niches that hold vestments and art. Following through to the end of the nave, one meets the beginning of the chancel, which houses the choir and the high altar. In previous centuries, a choir screen would block the nave from the chancel and high altar. In modern times, this has been moved to make the altar more accessible, yet the space between the high altar and the congregation is still arresting. At the crossing, before one enters the chancel, Two large rose windows are on either side of the building. Each intricate stained glass window depicts different biblical scenes. The north rose window has Mary seated on a throne with Jesus at the center, while the surrounding panels depict Old Testament kings and prophets. The south rose window has 84 panels depicting New Testament figures with Jesus on a throne and a lamb at the center. Turning around to face the west entrance, one can see the west rose window, which shows the Virgin Mary and Jesus surrounded by the 12 prophets, with additional rings of the seasons, virtues and vices, and the symbols of the zodiac. Just past the crossing is the choir, where clergy sit along the sides of the passage. Beyond this is the high altar, considered the holiest space in the church. It has sculpted scenes along its walls, and a statue of the Virgin Mary looms over it. Beyond it is the apse, which leads to separate chapels. The sacristy resides on the south side of the building and houses the many vestments and relics. Notre Dame is a resounding chorus of different pieces. It is filled with art. The stained glass windows allow colorful light into the building. The flying buttresses extend the ceiling high above the onlooker. Sculptures and biblical scenes adorn every space of the church. It is a fascinating and overwhelming experience, a church that swallows you in its expanse and evokes awe at every turn. The context of Paris and Gothic architecture. Since Notre Dame has stood for centuries, it's difficult to summarize the context it comes from. However, taking a look at medieval France can tell us a lot about why this cathedral was built the way it was. Christendom was well established across Europe when Notre Dame was built. Constantine and his mother Helen had begun the process of church building in the 4th century, which continued with fervor well into the Middle Ages. At that time, however, churches were being built not just for their utilitarian purpose, but as works of art in and of themselves. The Gothic architectural style was an artistic movement that had taken hold of Europe from the 12th to the 16th centuries. It was a style that emphasized color, grandeur, and light. Determining whether the cathedral's architecture was theologically or culturally influenced is nearly impossible, most probably because the Gothic style and theological thought of the day were so intermingled that it would not be possible to separate them. Along with this came the influence of patronage and the French economic system. Large Gothic cathedrals could be built rather quickly if those buildings had the right resources and workers. In just over 2 decades, the Chartres Cathedral just outside of Paris was built. Notre Dame relied on wealthy patrons in order to be built, as well as the skilled craftsmanship of tradespeople, some who would travel from other countries to complete the work. But construction took considerably longer to complete, largely due to poor financial planning. The feudal system of the day was also greatly reinforced by the architecture of the cathedral and the economic practices of the day. Wealthy attendees could buy prime seating in the cathedral, as well as tombs and private chapels that resided closer to the holiest space of the cathedral, the altar. Hierarchy was then further emphasized by the floor plan. While it was meant to also provoke the rite of pilgrimage for any believer, the king and clergy would perform a long procession from the nave to the altar, communicating the importance and perhaps divine favor that rested on the clergy and the empire. The cultural and theological emphases of the day tended to be about God's transcendence and man's sinfulness. The need to baptize and evangelize within the country was extremely low since most were baptized at birth. Instead, the cleansing of sin was emphasized through the rite of the Eucharist and the physical space itself. Common people could not partake in the Eucharist, and it would sit far away from the act itself in the nave. The cathedral is a church where participation is about observance. For most people, meeting God occurred in viewing the cathedral, an awesome display of light and grandeur which reflected the holy city and reminded them of God's holiness. The history of Notre Dame Cathedral. Notre Dame Cathedral has stood for 8 centuries and has seen a vast amount of history. This is part of what makes the building so fascinating. Its architectural features have not only served a religious purpose, but they have become political, national, and artistic in purpose as well. One of the most significant changes that Notre Dame ever underwent was during the Revolution in France. Because revolutionaries were frustrated with the monarchy, they were angry with the church by association. They viewed the church as a mere puppet for upholding the status quo, and the clergy as elites who lavished in luxury while the peasantry starved. In 1793, revolutionaries gutted the cathedral and first desecrated it by turning it into a stable for animals, before transforming it into a temple of the goddess Reason. This represented a transition from an oppressive religious order to a naturalistic, rational religious order. Note that the revolutionaries were not pagans nor atheists, rather deism prevailed, and the rebels largely opposed the existing Catholic institution. Soon after this, however, Napoleon Bonaparte became emperor and converted the cathedral back into a Catholic church. He saw the church as a powerful instrument for consolidating political power, and so he held his coronation in the partially renovated cathedral itself. This also helped solidify the cathedral as a symbol of French identity, perhaps heightening its political significance at the same time. Apart from this, Notre Dame also faced countless conflicts which converted it into an instrument of war. For example, in World War II, it was used as a sniper tower and was almost destroyed by the Nazis. The cathedral is also a work of art. In the 19th century, French architect Jean Viollet-le-Duc began restoring the cathedral. While there were guidelines to ensure orthodoxy, Viollet-le-Duc clearly valued his artistic endeavors as he worked on the church. In this way, the church was also an art piece, apart from being a religious institution. Today, however, we can observe the cathedral as a national symbol for the country of France. The day after the cathedral had burned in 2019, French President Emmanuel Macron spoke to the French people, vowing to restore the beloved building. Though France is predominantly secular, throngs of people gathered and sang hymns as they watched the cathedral burn. It seems that Notre Dame was not just an important historical or religious building, but it meant something to the French people themselves. It was a symbol of their identity. Notre Dame has stood the test of time, and what we can observe is that it has never remained static. Its architecture has held many meanings and purposes over the centuries, and has been a source of influence as well. Comparing the churches. Notre Dame Cathedral and the Church of Duraeuropas are vastly different buildings, yet they are united by a common faith. The architecture and nature of their buildings reveal their different theological emphases and practices. For example, Duraeuropas is found in a context of a cosmopolitan border town in a precarious political time. Notre Dame existed during a time of relative stability in its beginnings and under the heavy hand of Christendom. Their atonement theologies are also represented by the spaces most venerated by them. Duraeuropas focused on being welcomed into the family of God and the victory over evil through baptism, while Notre Dame's architecture focused on the need to be cleansed of sin through the Eucharist and the space between a holy God and an unholy people. But there remain some threads of commonality. By viewing both churches, we can observe the importance of visual storytelling and theology. Though used to varying degrees, both churches employed the use of art in their buildings in order to make a theological statement and help the viewers insert themselves into a story. Both churches as well reinforced relational boundaries with their spaces. For example, the church at Duraeuropas designated a space for initiates during the Eucharist, an intentional exclusion. The cathedral, in a similar way, communicated the authority of the clergy and the king through the separation of the choir and the nave. Overall, one cannot assume that these churches share nothing in common. Rather, we see how humans tend to communicate and the ways in which architecture speaks to them. Architecture is a cultural dialogue. Not only is it shaped by the culture it is a product of, but it shapes its culture in turn. The church is no exception to this dialogue. Church buildings speak to theology as much as theology speaks to them. By examining two strikingly different churches, we can make helpful observations about the ways they viewed God and their relationship to Him. In the same way, we should be able to examine our own churches. How do we use architecture to communicate our theology? How do current events shape our church practice? In light of COVID, what will change and what will remain the same? As you leave, reflect on your own church experience and how we conceive of it today. And think about the ways that church buildings might contribute to that conception. How has your church building shaped you? And how can we shape our church buildings to better reflect the purpose of the church and the gospel?